Kamal, can we just assess what you said yesterday, which I think was along the lines of, no, I don't think Trump will cut military aid. That would be ridiculous.
I did say so yesterday, just to bring everyone into it. So Camilla and I, obviously, we sit next to each other in the newsroom. You said, Camilla, golly, how are we going to be thinking about this tomorrow? Are they going to cut aid? And I said, no, Camilla, that would be absolutely ridiculous. I'm sure they're not going to do that. And here we are today. Donald Trump, as ever, has thrown a massive new boulder in the diplomatic pond and has taken a huge number of people by surprise by saying that America will stop all military aid reaching Ukraine.
It probably isn't that surprising. I mean, this was coming, but maybe people didn't think he could be that cravenly self-interested. Clearly is. It then begs the question, doesn't it? Well, can Ukraine not go it alone, but go at it and continue to fight Russia just with Europe's support and not America's? And quite interestingly, actually, the Royal United Services Institute, also known as RUSI, gives some calculations that are quite interesting, actually, maybe quite surprising, because according to them, only 20% of total military hardware supplied to Ukrainian forces comes from the US. Actually, 55% is home produced in Ukraine, and 25% comes from Europe and the rest of the world. But let's be honest, that 20% does pack more of a lethal punch than some of the other ammunitions that have been provided. That's the problem, right?
Yes, it's a question of, ground-to-air missiles versus drones. Drones are, quite easy lift in terms of making them and getting them in the air, and they're one of the most lethal weapons that Ukraine has. But when it comes to air cover and it comes to the actual missiles that are being used by Ukraine, as you say, the lethal part of their military hardware, that's where the US really matters.
Can I just qualify something I said earlier? Because righties like me are getting a bit of stick for now sort of turning slightly on Donald Trump. And I have made this point before, that we can agree with the US president on some things and not the other. And I've said that this is born out of craven self-interest. Maybe that is me being a bit cynical, but this is what we have been discussing. JD Vance and Donald Trump keep on arguing for what they're doing because they are interested in peace in Ukraine. And I think the discerning observer says, as you have, are you actually advocating for peace in Ukraine or for Ukraine just to surrender? That's the difference. One man's peace deal is another man's complete capitulation. Isn't that the problem?
Well,
here?
they've done that classic thing where they flooded the zone with their own vocabulary. So Donald Trump keeps saying, all we want is peace, all we want is peace. And as Zelensky says in response, what you are actually asking for is capitulation. And I think that one underexplored area is that whatever America decides, even if it decides it with Vladimir Putin, that Ukraine will continue. Now, It may not continue a full-scale war, but our partner podcast, Ukraine the Latest, with Dom Nichols and Francis Dernley, they've been covering resistance movements within already Russian-occupied territories on the eastern border of Ukraine. The idea that all these troops and the generals from Ukraine will simply lay down their arms and lose 20% of their country because Donald Trump has come to some kind of deal with Vladimir Putin, I think is contestable. And I think when you have the president of Ukraine saying that this war will go on and on, that is because a lot of his generals and some of the Ukrainian population, and let's not forget, Zelensky is still very popular within Ukraine. And I think some evidence, actually, he's become more popular since Trump has pushed him so harshly with his language about dictatorship and peace deal, that actually Zelensky is starting to see a situation with European support and other support from around the world, like Canada, for example, and maybe Australia, which has said that it could come in with Keir Starmer's idea of a peacekeeping force, boots on the ground. It could continue. And let's get into the point in a second. The odd situation is, Camilla, could we see ourselves in a year's time? Yes, America has detached, but the war is going on.
For instance, Johnny wrote to us to say, if you're going to have someone like Michael Wolff on the pod, this is referring to Trump's rather critical biographer who we spoke to yesterday, please can you balance it with an informed view who does not have Trump derangement syndrome. I mean, I can't call myself somebody who has Trump derangement syndrome. As I've said in the past, I do support a number of his initiatives, but on this, it's very, very difficult, I think, as somebody who feels patriotic, not just about Britain, but our role in Europe and indeed the sovereignty of an independent nation that has faced an illegal invasion. It's quite tricky to support him on this.
We did make it clear in the pod yesterday as well. We got another message from John Howard. Thanks, John, for writing in again. I know that you're one of our listeners. And he did say, and which is what we spoke about, he said, "Hi, Kamal, I thought your final summing up on Trump was absolutely spot on and just highlighted Michael Wolff's rather superficial assessment of a very complex character. As you said, Trump uses pantomime and theatre like any good game player to throw everybody off guard while he plots a route towards his strategic goals." And then just on that, Camilla, the point that Trump and those around him can keep saying is, what was the alternative from the European Union, from the UK, from Joe Biden before Trump got into the White House? Because whatever your alternative was didn't work either.
No.
All it got us to, I think the big pro card for Trump, taking away the politics and what we think of what he's doing, is the alternative is continuing war. Is the European Union and the UK and others, are they going to be able to stand up enough to defeat Russia? That seems almost impossible. So therefore, are we just saying there will be this never-ending war on the eastern borders of Europe, just like there has been a never-ending war for Israel against the Middle Eastern countries that want to see its destruction? And that is the big failure of what you might describe as the other side of the debate, and why, although I know that Keir Starmer and those around him really feel he's having a good foreign crisis here, and the polls are starting to suggest that, what is your alternative is something that Keir Starmer and others find almost impossible to answer. And I think that's where Trump has some political momentum and support.
A never-ending war may be preferable, I'm sorry to say this, may be preferable to emboldening Putin to such an extent that the rest of the world is under threat. This is the problem. Donald Trump made that point that he only had 4% support Zelensky. Do you remember in that original Truth Social post? And it's now emerged that before Donald Trump returned to office at the start of 2025, Zelensky was on 52%. But after Donald Trump blamed Ukraine for starting the war, Zelensky's popularity has now hit 65%. But as we've been recording this podcast, it is interesting because Trump and Vance do seem to have pushed Zelensky into the position of now saying that Ukraine definitely does have a commitment to peace. He said, none of us wants an endless war. Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. So he's clearly moving closer to that position, perhaps mindful of those approval ratings, perhaps mindful of the fact that the Ukrainian people, at the end of the day, don't want to see any more bloodshed. However, and this is the interesting point, Kamal, what happens if Ukrainian soldiers on the ground just keep on wanting to fight? Because they say to themselves, what's the point of being invested in this if we're going to have some kind of capitulation to Putin? The Telegraph's own Verity Bowman is in Ukraine and she spoke to soldiers on the ground about this.
Hello from eastern Ukraine. We're driving from Dnipro towards the front lines in Donetsk with a serving soldier at the wheel. We're in a rush to meet a Ukrainian prisoner of war, but I've been asking Ukrainians and our driver what they think of the end of US military aid. Mikhail, who has spent most of the war fighting in Donetsk, said he and his fellow soldiers will keep fighting, even becoming partisans if necessary, if supplies dwindle.
Verity there from Dnipro, adding to that sense that I'm getting that Ukraine doesn't see this as peace because Russia will continue, maybe after Trump has gone, 4 years' time, there'll be another war, there'll be another incursion, to use Putin's language, invasion, to use truthful language, and that more people will die. So it will not ultimately save Ukrainian lives, because what Putin wants is Ukraine to be a vassal state of Russia. and that people who don't want that, well, we know how Putin treats his enemies. Let's go on to the JD Vance interview overnight on Fox News. He said that the best way to protect Ukraine from another Russian invasion is to guarantee that the US has a financial interest in Ukraine's future.
The president knows that, look, if you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country and ensure that America has a long-term interest. You're not going to do that if you come to the Oval Office, insult the president, and refuse to follow his plan for peace.
Well, JD Vance, I think, has already realised that his comments have not gone down well. He's just tweeted that the attack that he was attacking the UK, possibly France, who have fought alongside America in many conflicts. He said, "This is absurdly dishonest. I don't even mention the UK or France in the clip, both of whom have fought bravely alongside the US over the last 20 years and beyond."
Which country is he talking about then?
And also classic, isn't it, Camilla? You throw the dead cat into the room and then you express surprise that everyone responded to what you said.
The quote comes to mind, "Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it." The idea that the British haven't fought a war in 30 to 40 years, when we have sent troops out to Iraq, Afghanistan and other conflicts, started by the US in many cases, is for the birds. I mean, if you were in the military or you're an ex-service person who had been wounded in the field of conflict, or indeed if you've lost one of your fellow men or women, I mean, honestly, you would feel so insulted by that. JD Vance is an intelligent man. I thought it was interesting when Michael Wolff was saying, oh, he's just a relevance. He's basically just Trump's bitch. And don't forget, this was a man who was a never-Trumper and now is absolutely backing Trump up every step of the way. He himself admitted in Hillbilly Elegy, his own autobiography, that he did serve in the Marines, but only in a writing and recording role, which has been seized upon by the likes of Johnny Mercer and other soldiers turned MPs to say, mate, if you haven't been in the dust and the bloodshed of a conflict, please don't comment like this.
JD Vance, obviously, as you say, controversial comments there. He also argued that he believed that the population in Europe will turn against this conflict, that there'll be war fatigue, that Europe is more interested in its own economic, future, etc., etc. I think there is a point where the fact that the European Union and the UK has struggled to grow over the past 10 plus years has meant there hasn't been the focus on defence spending that there should have been. But there is a point there to JD Vance. But I think what's actually happening is Trump's comments and Vance's comments are meaning that actually support for Ukraine is growing. And you were arguing yesterday, Camilla, that Kemi Badenoch needed to be much more front foot, needed to decide. There are sides here. It is clear that there are now sides in this debate. And some people around appear to have heard your advice. This morning, she was out aggressively after the announcement that the US would be withdrawing aid. She said in a tweet, "The news overnight that America is halting military aid to Ukraine is profoundly worrying. It is clear that Britain and Europe must rearm much faster if we want to provide Ukraine with more than just warm words of support. We must work to keep America in and Russia out."
Certainly more decisive than Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, who was flailing about on the broadcast round this morning.
I think that President Putin will see that Europe is stepping up and are very clear around who the aggressor was, that Ukraine has the support of the United Kingdom, Europe, and that the US wants to see peace in that area as well.
You genuinely think Putin this morning is thinking US wants to see peace? Well, yeah, maybe on Putin's terms. This is a major moment, and you're sounding like it's business as usual, if you don't mind me saying.
No, I'm not. It's a very serious moment, and I think the Prime Minister has been, very serious about how he's conducted himself.
That was yesterday before we knew. I'm trying to get a sense of what's happened in Downing Street since that announcement about Donald Trump stopping US military aid to Ukraine? We know what happened yesterday, but this has developed.
Well, I can remind you of what the Prime Minister said yesterday, and it hasn't changed from yesterday to today, and that he's laser focused on getting peace. He won't be derailed by announcements. He will.
Didn't seem to be up to speed with events, was speaking as if it was yesterday afternoon, not today, now that the cut to military aid has been announced by Trump. Difficult positioning. I don't know, why is she on the round? She's not the person to be on it.
She was on the. This is where Labour is struggling. It is still trying to keep some form of domestic agenda going. So she was on the round this morning because of the workers' rights legislation that Labour want to bring in for the UK. But she absolutely wasn't the person to be out on the day that America has announced it could be putting the transatlantic alliance at risk, and certainly not to come out with briefing notes, as you say, that were 24 hours out of date.
Well, all of this brings us neatly onto our guest, the Telegraph's Defence and Foreign Affairs editor, Coughlin. Con, lovely to see you on the Daily Tea today. My goodness me, it's been a momentous few days, hasn't it? Every evening seems to bring a new announcement from Trump. This time that he is cutting military aid to Ukraine. How surprised are you by that announcement?
Well, not very is the answer, Camilla. I think if anyone's been following Trump for the last year, really, can see that he's very sceptical about American support for Ukraine. He said that he didn't see the point of the US spending all this money to support a war many thousands of miles away from Washington. And so here we are in March 2025, and he's done what he said he's going to do. Of course, it's not helped by that car crash of a meeting he had with Zelensky at the White House last week. But even without that, I think he was on this trajectory. And I think what surprises me is that the Europeans are surprised this has happened, and they're now running around like headless chickens trying to work out what to do.
But do you agree with Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary's analysis? He's writing for the Telegraph today, basically saying that at its worst, this amounts to the US siding with Russia and by implication China against its European allies and Ukraine. I mean, is that how you interpret this now?
Well, I personally think it's too early to make that judgment. I mean, there's a lot of hot air coming out of Washington. Let's not forget, Trump's only been in office a few weeks, and he's trying to dramatically change the geopolitical landscape. I don't personally think that Trump wants a Ukraine deal that makes Putin look good. I don't think he wants that. I think he wants to bully the Ukrainians into actually accepting that there needs to be peace negotiations, and I think that's what's going on at the moment. But we don't really know what's on the Russian end, and he's just hit China with sanctions. So the idea that he's sort of trying to cozy up to Beijing, I don't think is right. But this is very dangerous, and a lot of commentators have said, Putin will be rubbing his hands with glee at what's going on within the transatlantic relationship and in terms of our support for Ukraine. But, let's just see how this plays out and not get too knee-jerk about it.
Con, how long politically and more importantly militarily can Ukraine continue prosecuting the war without this US support that Trump has said is now going to be withdrawn?
Well, I think the Ukrainians have got the ability to carry on fighting at the same sort of level for a few more months. And you might recall that one of the last things the Biden administration did before it stepped down was to get as much equipment out of the door to Ukraine as possible, because they anticipated this is how Trump would behave. So, I mean, the Ukrainians don't tell us what their stockpiles are, but I imagine they're pretty well resourced. In addition, the Ukrainians are developing their own defense capabilities, particularly drones, etc. The Europeans are ramping up supplies of ammunition, but the big hole that the Ukrainians will be looking at is air defenses. And, virtually every day the Russians are attacking Ukraine with drones, missiles, and they rely very heavily on the American supplied air defense systems to defend themselves. And without that, that could make life very difficult for Ukraine indeed. And when you look around Europe, including the UK, our ability to fill that gap, that very important military gap, is pretty limited. I mean, our own UK air defence is almost non-existent at the moment, and it's one of the things that the government is looking at getting a grip on very quickly. But as I said, when you look around Europe at the moment, the cupboard's pretty bare.
I assume, Con, you're talking about years rather than months, and obviously years will be too long for Ukraine. Has Trump signalled over the first few weeks of his presidency that the transatlantic alliance, which has kept peace in Europe since the Second World War, led by the US, is over?
I don't think so. I mean, I think Trump, as he did during his first term in office, wants the European wing of NATO to do more, to pay for their own defence and to have their own defence capabilities. And I wrote an article for the Telegraph last week, just setting out how this could be achieved. That the Europeans, rather than building their own tanks and jets and everything else, should work together so that we've got combined capabilities that are actually effective. And that is doable within the NATO umbrella, and that would really enhance the NATO alliance. And if that happened, we might be talking in a few years' time about how Trump saved NATO. So, but certainly the Trump administration is providing an enormous challenge for the European side of the NATO alliance. But let's not forget that Americans' defense is also dependent on a strong NATO. Our military ties, our own military ties here in the UK with the US, have been developed over decades, not just to defend the UK, but to defend the US, which is why the US is so heavily involved in our nuclear deterrent and other elements. So there's still a lot that needs to be looked at and worked through, but this is certainly a big challenge, Kamal.
On that note, Con, what did you make of JD Vance, the Vice President's interview with Fox News, where he basically suggested that the British were just, quote, some random country that hadn't fought a war in 40 years? I mean, that's obviously caused great offence to those who are involved in the military, not least figures like Johnny Mercer and James Heapy, former MPs who are in the Defence Department, saying, hang on a minute, we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan on your behalf.
Yeah, and we fought against ISIS more recently. Well, I mean, there are a lot of people in the Trump administration who like to shoot from the hip. And I think, there is certainly a view in American military circles that because we have run down our defense capabilities, we're not much value to the US as a military ally per se at the moment. But again, the Starmer government says it's going to spend more on defence, and there's a defence review coming up, and we'll have to see what it looks like. But it is rather insulting, and particularly when you look at the British service men and women who lost their lives and suffered severe injuries in those campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is quite insulting.
Con, I know how difficult this is, and you've been a brilliant guest on the podcast on many occasions. Could you give us any sense, as you look at how this conflict is developing, about where we might be in 3 to 6 months? There is certainly a suggestion, particularly within Ukraine, that we are hearing that they want to and will fight on. Volodymyr Zelensky has said this war will last for a long time, even with US withdrawal. Can you see us still speaking about conflict between Ukraine and Russia in 6 months?
Well, I think that's a distinct possibility, Kamal. I mean, let's not forget this war's been going on at least since 2014, and before when the Russians first invaded Crimea and the Donbass. And before then, there were skirmishes. So, there's been a lot of tension between Kyiv and Moscow for more than a decade. So the prospect that this could continue if the West lose interest in the war should not be discounted. Of course, the Ukraine's ability to fight Russia without support from at least Europe or others would be very questionable. And the other thing that's quite evident now, and you've seen this from the meetings of the Europeans and even what Trump is saying, is the narrative now is about how do you end the war rather than how do you continue it, and that is a big sea change from last year. But if there isn't a deal that the Ukrainians find satisfactory, and let's look at the suffering and losses the Ukrainians have endured in the last 3 or so years. Coming on for 100,000 dead, the economy wrecked, a fifth of the population living in exile. I mean, they've been through a lot, and they're not going to sign up to something. There's an absolute betrayal of those sacrifices. So, as I say, it's very hard to make a prediction on where it's going. But the important thing, the important dynamic change, is that everybody is now talking about how to end the war rather than how to sustain it. So let's see where that goes.
Is there any way, Con, at all, that Russia can be defeated and pushed back?
Well, the Russians, have suffered terribly. And, I think there'll be a lot of people in the Pentagon who previously thought, for the relatively small amount of money we are giving Ukraine, we are destroying the Russian military without having a direct confrontation. So there'll be a lot of people in the Pentagon ruining Trump's decision to withdraw support for Ukraine. But, this is a very complex situation. So, just how it's going to resolve for the Ukrainians, we'll just have to watch this space, I'm afraid, Kamal.
Just listening to Con there, and all the time, since Friday, all I've been thinking in my mind is the Kremlin must be loving this. And lo and behold, actually, it's been retweeted by James Heape, who is the former Armed Forces Minister, and he served in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's actually the defence editor of The Economist making the point. If you were the Kremlin, why would you make any concessions right now? You have every incentive to demand it all. Land, sanctions relief, demilitarisation, neutralisation, and no troops in Ukraine. If it collapses, Trump will likely blame Ukraine anyway, allowing continuation of war. This is a retweet of Shawshank Joshi, who is the defence editor of The Economist. I just thought that summed it up quite nicely.
And I think the second point from Con there is that America can't unilaterally withdraw from world security, and that European security is part of that. So the idea that Trump appears to be at least playing with, that somehow he can cauterize Europe and not be involved in European security, but the rest of the security apparatus, the global security apparatus, will continue. We, of course, as the UK, are involved in Five Eyes, which is the main security apparatus, the intelligence services of the leading Western nations. We support America in patrolling, in very important shipping lanes through the Red Sea in the Middle East. Peace in the Middle East, or how we get to peace in the Middle East, is very much also supported by the UK alongside the US. And to your point about fighting alongside America in Afghanistan, fighting alongside America in Iraq to not only appalling deaths that were suffered by British troops as well as others, also a lot of controversial political damage taken by the UK government of many different stripes. You can't cut one off from the other. And I think the big question now, as we watch the unfolding events, is this idea that JD Vance said, there is only one show in town, and that is Donald Trump. Once you get Europe, and then you've got to consider Russia and China, there isn't only one game in town. There are other games in town, and it's whether Europe can now step up and be one of those.
The Ukrainians have got the ability to carry on fighting at the same sort of level for a few more months. And you might recall that one of the last things the Biden administration did before it stepped down was to get as much equipment out of the door to Ukraine as possible, because they anticipated this is how Trump would behave.